Hello everyone, this is Dr. K. Narayan. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. Can everybody hear me? All right, thank you so much for waiting. I'll start in just 1 minute. Let's get started. Sorry, again, apologies for the delay. There were some problems on streaming on my side, but let's get started. My name is Dr. K. Narayan, and welcome to this workshop. Just to give you very brief background about myself, I have a PhD in physics, but also over the past, I would say 2 decades, I have been experimenting with different spirituality traditions, in particular yoga. So let me get started right away. This webinar is about non-duality, and I will talk about different streams that have flown, starting from the very beginning of Eastern wisdom, then science, and then modern materials such as Law of One. So before we begin, this telecast is available for later viewing, so you can watch it as many times as you want. Second, please refrain from posting unnecessary comments in the chat. There's a Q&A after the workshop, so you can ask me any questions at that time. And third, most of the resources that I mentioned here are available on the website where you can go over them, books and all. The way I have organized this presentation is that I have actually created a video that goes into details and keeps it professional. So we will just get started with the video. One second. I think there is a problem with video. Give me a second.
Is to examine form and non-duality means things that appear to be separate are not really separate, but are different manifestations of the same underlying reality. One way to understand this is to examine form and substance. Take gold, for example. Many things can be made from gold, giving it form. One can make objects, animals, or people with gold. But these forms depend on the substance of gold, which has a reality independent of form. By studying the properties of gold rather than its forms, one understands a deeper reality. Another way is to examine energy. Take electricity, for example. Electricity can manifest as motion in a fan, as light in a light bulb, as sound in a speaker. In a computer, it manifests as an intelligence that can perform complicated tasks. The concept of non-duality first appeared in the Vedas, ancient spiritual and philosophical texts in India. During the Vedic times, spiritual attainment was so highly valued that half of human life was dedicated in its pursuit. In that system, the first quarter of life was devoted to study, the next quarter to household and worldly duties, and the remainder to spiritual progress. This concerted effort over many generations produced an extensive philosophical and spiritual body of work known as the Vedas. There are 4 principal Vedas. The distilled essence of Vedas appears in books called the Upanishads, which are considered parts of the Vedanta, meaning combination of Vedas. One Upanishad that explores non-duality in great details is the Chandogya Upanishad. A part of Sama Veda, scholars estimate it is around 3,000 years old. In chapter 6 of this Upanishad, a dialogue takes place between the sage Udalak and his son Shwetaketu. When Shwetaketu was 12 years old, he went away for higher studies, similar to our college education. When he returned after 12 years, he was so full of pride that Udalak became concerned. Being the wise sage he was, Udalak asked Shwetaketu, "My son, in your studies, did you learn about what powers our perception, but itself cannot be perceived?" Did you learn about what gives us the ability to know, but itself cannot be known? Shwetaketu was humbled by this simple question. Although he had learned about medicine, mathematics, and rules of proper conduct, he had not learned anything about the nature of reality. So he asked Udalak, "Father, will you please teach me?" Udalak then discussed form and substance. Just as one can understand the essence of things by studying the substance rather than the form, one can understand the nature of reality by understanding the root cause of consciousness. In Vedas, the root cause of consciousness is called Brahman, the supreme reality. At the conclusion of this examination of fundamental reality, Udalak made this famous statement, Tat Tvam Asi, or Thou art that. The root cause of consciousness, the timeless and formless essence that you are. In other words, the individual self is the same as Brahman. It just appears separate and different. The statement, Thou art that, is called a Mahavakya, a supreme statement. All four Vedas have similar Mahavakya, such as, inner consciousness is Brahman, this self is Brahman, and I am Brahman. The reason these teachings are called Vedanta is because the teaching, Thou art that, is the ultimate teaching. One cannot improve upon this teaching, but can only aspire to understand and express it more fully. Various sages have described this ultimate truth in different ways. Perhaps the clearest explanation was given by Shankar, who wrote a small poem called Atma Shatakam, meaning 6 verses for the self. The poem says, I am not the mind, nor intellect, nor ego, nor senses. I am beyond. I am none of the triad of the observer, the process of observing, or the object being observed. I am all-pervasive. I am without attributes and without form. I have attachment neither to the world nor to the liberation. I have no wishes for anything, because I am everything, everywhere, every time, always in equilibrium. I am indeed that eternal knowing and bliss, that love and pure consciousness, the supreme being. You may wonder, is non-duality just a philosophy, or does it have any basis in real experience? If we look at the foundations of Vedanta, which predates religions, it was not mere philosophy. It had 3 logical foundations. In fact, it closely aligned with the scientific method, which was developed thousands of years later. The first foundation is Shruti, collective wisdom. This corresponds to teachings and books. The second is Yukti, reason. The third, and most important, is Anubhav, experience. Considering that sages in that time had no means of formal scientific inquiry, it is understood that all of this knowledge resulted from their own inner experience. The direct personal experience of Brahman is called Samadhi, which means absorption in oneness. It is due to the experience of Samadhi that Brahman is known by another name, Satchid Ananda. The word Satchidananda has 3 parts. Sat means truth. This is not ordinary truth, but truth that is outside the confines of time and space, and thus absolute existence. Chit means consciousness. Ananda means bliss. A note of clarification on bliss. It is not that Brahman is bliss, but that the human experience of Brahman is bliss. Brahman is beyond attributes. Going back to our example of electricity, if you wanted a direct personal experience of electricity, by touching a wire, you would experience a shock. But electricity itself is not a shock. Similarly, Brahman is this primal energy which manifests in the universe, and human experience of this energy is bliss. Samadhi is the highest human experience. Over time, a technology called yoga was developed to make this experience available to seekers. Yoga means the union of the individual self, which has forgotten that it is Brahman, with the Supreme Self. If you look at the experience of yogis from the earliest known accounts to the modern age, they discuss samadhi in which they experience oneness with all creation. Out of dozens of biographies and autobiographies about such yogis, the most popular ones are Autobiography of a Yogi, Play of Consciousness, and Sadguru, More Than a Life. Perhaps the best explanation of non-duality comes from the Ra material, which calls non-duality the law of one. You are everything, every being, every emotion, every event, every situation. You are unity. You are infinity. You are love light, light love. You are. This is the law of one. A great development in our understanding of reality has happened with the journey of modern physics, which broke down the notions of duality that were so firmly set by Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is an epitome of duality. In this paradigm, objects move in space because of forces acting on them. Each object is separate from each other and the forces. The Newtonian worldview considers the universe a big, completely deterministic machine. In this view, there is no importance given to consciousness, because matter is seen as the foundation of reality, which somehow creates consciousness, but itself is independent of it. This worldview began to fall apart in the 20th century with the arrival of relativity and quantum mechanics. Relativity breaks down the duality of matter and energy. Einstein's famous equation says that matter is energy. Even more important, time and space are fundamentally the same physical entity, known as space-time. Our understanding took another revolutionary leap with quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics studies fundamental particles such as electrons, protons, and quarks. When physicists studied these particles, they discovered something puzzling. These particles are not particles at all, but are waves of possibilities. An electron is not a tiny ball circling the nucleus. It is all around the nucleus at the same time, creating the electron cloud. Quantum mechanics also breaks down the barriers between the observer and the observed, hence recognizing consciousness as the primal cause which changes a fundamental particle from a wave that exists over extended space into a localized particle. The act of observation brings it into existence from the unmanifested field of possibility. The quantum fields which give rise to different particles arise from a single field, sometimes known as the source field, or zero-point energy, or simply the field. In the past few decades, significant research has been done to understand the field and its relationship to consciousness. It appears that the field is the energetic backdrop of all existence and connects every part of the universe with everything else through non-local quantum effects. Most importantly, the field responds to consciousness, as shown by experiments with devices called random event generators. If you have a device that creates zeros and ones, in the language of computers, a truly random event generator will produce an equal number of zeros and ones. That is exactly what we see from a generator when no human intention interferes with it. But when people or groups of people focus their attention on this generator, they can move it away from this equal distribution to generate either more zeros or more ones. Other phenomena of group consciousness can also be explained using the field, such as a drop in a city's crime rate, when there are sufficient numbers of trained meditators focusing their intention together. If you are interested in exploring the science of such experiments, please read the book The Field. To conclude, there is an underlying reality that manifests this universe. Our individual consciousness is the same as that supreme reality. How can you put this knowledge of non-duality into practice? Here are the steps. First, know yourself as a divine being, because you are an aspect of the Source. You are giving the Source an opportunity to look through your eyes and experience its own creation. This knowledge removes mental distortions such as fear. If you are the Source, what is there to be afraid of? There is no reason to fumble in the dark when you realize that you are the light itself. Get rid of toxic thought patterns that contaminate mass consciousness. In particular, you are not a sinner. You are not a frivolous creation of a judgmental and petty God who wants you to obey his will. That is just a story made up by institutions that want to control you. It is time to take your power back from those institutions and walk on this earth as manifestations of the Source energy, expressing the primal joy and love that you are. Second, stop judging and criticizing yourself for perceived flaws. There are no flaws, only aspects of perfection to be explored. This is similar to art, which can always be improved upon, but that doesn't mean it's flawed. Instead of self-judgment, treat yourself with compassion and self-love. Third, you are one with all conscious beings and entire creation. Once you see others as Source, you let go of the need to control them, manipulate them, or have power over them. You also stop judging them for perceived imperfections. Instead, you treat them with love and compassion, because they are extended parts of your being. So honor them, offer them your love through service, and make relationships the joyous journey of creativity, genuine communication, and shared experience. Fourth, the material and the spiritual are the same. You did not come here to transcend physicality, because physicality is a manifestation of the Source. You came here to perceive physicality as divine, and in the process become an instrument of joy. This requires you to examine deeply held beliefs about physicality, including the expression of sexuality. Let go of shame and guilt associated with expressions of physicality, and ask yourself, how would I express my physicality if I knew myself as a divine being? Fifth, know that your incarnation has a built-in purpose. The purpose is to explore physicality, relationships, service, and your own highest potential. You are here to manifest higher spiritual qualities in every aspect of your daily life. This is a divine undertaking, one that may take many incarnations to perfect. But the journey should be taken with a spirit of gratitude and purpose, not as a burden or suffering. All suffering is a mental illusion that exists so that you can transcend it and know yourself as the Source, the absolute reality, Brahman.
Okay, so that was the presentation. I'm hearing that my voice is not audible, so give me 1 second. Let me just make sure that my microphone is turned up. I think that's it. So, okay, great. So here are the further steps. First one is our next event, which is going to be about in a month, is on beyond suffering. The biggest problem we feel as human beings is suffering, and we don't even realize that suffering is manufactured in our own mind. It's not something outside of us. It's our mind that's creating suffering through thoughts and identification with things that it is not. So, in this presentation, I will go more into different philosophical traditions that talk about suffering and what are the practical steps that we can use to overcome suffering. So this is available. If you click on this link, it will take you to a meetup page where you can register for that. I will also post it in the chat. So I posted a link. If you click on it, you should be able to RSVP on Meetup. Second, all of these resources that I have are available for free, including the books that I recommend. And I will go over the website, but the recommendations page has all of these books and resources that you need. And lastly, there were other videos that were produced in the past 6 months, and they are all available on the website. Let me just actually show you the website and where to navigate. So this is the site. Sorry. If you go to courses here, Foundations is what you are looking for as the first course, and it has 3 courses. First one is on spiritual research, the second is aligning with your life purpose, and third is living with joy. These are basic courses that I recommend for everybody. And then there is the second set of instructions, which is on practical living, so which includes things such as health, love and service, yoga, and how to deal with others and manage your power. So with that, we are pretty much done with the webinar part of it. Now let's open up for questions. Now what I want to do is, we have limited time, so I want to focus on the material that was covered in the webinar today. So if you have any questions about the material that was covered in the webinar, let's start with them. And if we have time, then we can take other questions. But for now, let's focus on material that was covered. Question from Linnea. How can we allow ourselves to have luxuries and accept our desires without feeling like we are being greedy, or we are not deserving, or not good enough? I think that's a great question. So first of all, allowing ourselves an opportunity to feel joy does not mean that we are greedy. Greed is typically a manifestation of ego, which is always looking to expand itself through power or accumulation. You do not need to have, so make a differentiation between true joy, which is not something external to you, versus joy, which is an internal expression. Now that being said, I understand there is suffering in this world, but you do not help the suffering by feeling powerless and miserable yourself. The only way you can contribute to the lessening of suffering is, first of all, by feeling joy, by feeling purpose, and by being your best self. Okay, too many questions. Let me take a question from Smriti. We intellectually know that we are the source, so then why do we feel duality? Now, this is part of the incarnation. So there's a talk that I gave some time back. When we come into this reality, there is a mechanism by which we forget who we really are, and that is called the veil. The veil exists so that you can have a fresh experience and experience reality in its totality without. So, if you did not have the veil, that will prevent you from fully experiencing this reality, and that's the mechanism. Now, the veil is thinning, and that's why there are so many people who have what are called spiritual experience and experience of oneness, and it is happening all over the world. So the veil exists so that we can learn and also transcend this limitation. Question about how do we see others as extensions of ourselves, even though they behave in ways that would be incomprehensible to us. So understand that I think there are two parts to this question. One is there's a strong sense of judgment about how a person should behave. And it's because of that judgment that we feel separate. Now, this does not mean that we let people do whatever they want to do. There's a purpose of them being them and you being you, and that is you want to learn from the experience. If we were all the same, if there was total uniformity on this planet, there will be no point of living on this planet because there will be no learning. It's only through contrast. It's only through seeing darkness that you understand light. It's only through seeing hatred and violence that you understand what is true love. So, do not try to demonize what you perceive to be of lower vibration. It is an extension of you because you are trying to learn through that low vibration and raise your own vibration in the process. Question from Orion. Could you expand on the book of Ra and how does that apply to our reality? The Ra material is highly advanced spiritual material. I would say, in my opinion, it's the highest material available on this planet. It goes into multiple dimensions. It talks about the evolution of consciousness. It talks about what is the proper way to treat others. And in terms of consciousness, what is known as polarity. Polarity is just like there's a positive charge and negative charge in creation, there is polarity in service to self versus service to others. And both are the paths that consciousness takes. So it's too broad a subject. I would recommend you read a book called Living the Law of One. It's available, the reference is available on my website. Question, how to take the intellectual understanding of non-duality and make it embodied experience? There are few things on that same part. First one is, there is an intellectual understanding that has to become deeper. Just like you have never seen electrons, but you believe in electrons at a very deep level, right? And the reason is because there is decades of learning about that. And that's why it has become an internalized knowledge. Similarly, it's easy to understand that we are part of the source if there is a deeper understanding of that. The second part is there are techniques available in yoga where you do the practices and eventually the consciousness merges in the highest self. And that, from yogic perspective, is enlightenment. So at this point, I would recommend do your own research. The 3 books that I talked about on yoga, read all of them and see which one resonates with you. Question from Philip, what exactly is Brahman? So In its purest form, Brahman is a reality that's without any attributes. So it's not a person. It's not even a consciousness in the way that we understand. It's the primal energy that is still intelligent. So it would come closest to what we know in quantum mechanics as the field, which itself cannot be perceived, but which gives rise to entire reality. So the pictures of Brahman are personalization of that energy, and they help you. Again, these are signposts. If they help you, then that's good. If they don't help you, then that's not good. Just as a signpost is not the actual location, it just points you in the right direction. Great question. It says, part of the video said that there are no flaws in oneself and basically anything goes. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is there is a difference between seeing yourself as flawed and hence inadequate and hence seeing yourself with judgment versus being on a journey of growth where you understand that you need to improve, but there is no emotional negativity that's attached with judgment. So as long as you have the right attitude, growth is a great journey. Question from Smriti. Why do some human beings remain in low vibration even though they suffer? Again, I think you are judging them. Every single path is a valid path. A being that incarnates hundreds of times and experiences negativity and suffering in the depth of being, that's still a valid path. So, there are no wrong paths. Now, the only thing that matters for you is what is the path that you want to take. Question. What if somebody is obviously doing harm to others and destruction to the environment? How can you embrace and love? Aren't you encouraging? Love does not mean passivity. So let's make a clear distinction. Passivity is you don't do anything. Love is you do something without trying to demonize the other person. I think the best example of this is Gandhi. When he was fighting the British Empire, he didn't say, I'm against the British Empire. In fact, in the Second World War, when Britain was fighting, he actually called off all the different protests that they were planning against the Britishers because they were not enemies. They are people just like you and me who might have forgotten who they are, and that's why they are doing what they are doing. Now, be careful about judging people too harshly and hating them, because hatred is the first step towards madness. If you look at the history of our world, all the terrible crimes that were committed against humanity started with the simple process of hating. And the moment you hate others, you dehumanize them. And that's why all transgressions against them become valid in your own mind. And that's why if you look at all the genocides and wars, they were all justified in the people's minds because that's how they thought. Question. Does the deep desire to understand the higher self bring you closer to non-duality? That is correct. The more we start to identify ourselves from our deeper inner being and disassociate from outer things such as accomplishments or money or influence or fame and so on, the door opens for us, because at that moment we become a seeker, and that's the first step. Once we become the seeker and we start the journey inward, It's just a matter of time before we find the right teaching. And that's why it is said that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. The book, I think, question from Roland. How do you spell the title of the book that you said is the best one? It's called The Raw Material. Let me type it here. If you go to their websites, they have these books available for free. The book that I recommend is called Living the Law of One. That's the title. Question: what are the practices that can help remove judgment from our lives? The first practice is awareness. The moment you judge somebody, most of the times it happens without you even thinking about it. The moment you are aware and you see yourself as judging somebody else, that's the starting point. And then you go a little bit deeper. And then when you go deeper, you start asking yourself the question, why exactly am I judging this person? And then after a while, it becomes clear to you that you are judging them because you want to feel superior to them. And that's the trick of the ego, which is trying to make itself better by putting others down. Question from Smriti. Are you taking on students? Do you have live video, one-on-one classes? At this moment, I am not. But I'll be happy to probably answer any short questions you have. You can reach me through the webinar, the email that you have got. Okay, any other questions? Question from Robin. How do you know that you are being your best self? Well, you have to just ask yourself, in this moment, am I giving this moment my best effort and my best thoughts? And the first step in that direction is being present in this moment. If you are not present, obviously you cannot give this moment your best self. Question, I think Stephanie, if you have manifested illness at young ages from stress and genetics as well as ancestral karma, is there a way to reverse it? If you truly believe you are healed, can you overcome it? The answer is yes. The manifestation, the outer manifestation is the effect. The cause is the inner thoughts and state of being. Now, that being said, it's almost too easy to always judge your experience as not worthwhile, and hence you can miss the learning that you were supposed to take from that experience. So, have the awareness that everything in this universe, everything that's on your path, is exactly the way it's supposed to be. And once you start living in that peace, that's where the doors open. Question from Uriya. What are your thoughts about psychedelics? So here are my thoughts. Once again, this is just my own opinion, but specifically in yoga, psychedelics are prohibited. And the reason is these are doorways into consciousness. But just as you need a guide, if you go to some other space, the person who can actually give them to you has to have the right level of consciousness that they can guide you. And they can, and the thing with psychedelics is, again, the universe is connected. So the person who can guide you has to be in a very high state of enlightenment himself or herself before they can guide you. Now, typically that's not the human experience. And that's why psychedelics become one more mental crutch and they can turn addictive. So I would say stay away from them. But once again, as I said, your path is a valid path. So I would say still feel free to experiment and see where it takes you. But from the perspective of yoga, they are prohibited. Question from Magdalena. How can you embrace vulnerability? Vulnerability. Sorry. Well, again, the reason is at the core, you have to be comfortable with who you are and with reality. Now, that does not mean that there won't be disappointments in your life, and they can happen at different levels. But you have to have a practice of going in peace. Maybe you start with few minutes every day and try to see who you really are, not in relation to outside things. So these disappointments will have the proper context and the proper perspective. Question from MS. What happens after all returns to source? In my experience, this is an infinite journey. So even though we may think that once we graduate from the earth school, that's the end of it, that's just one class. There are infinite levels after that. And again, raw material goes more into details, but we are timeless beings. There is always more to learn, experience, and that's the way we derive joy. Question from Bob. A friend's daughter died suddenly and shockingly. How can my friend realistically avoid the suffering of grief, which you describe as mental illusion? I'm not saying that we should look at things which are obviously very hard and just say these are mental illusions and that's why we won't suffer. There is a degree of separation that we feel when somebody dies because we will not see them in a physical form. But again, from reason, everything that has taken form is going to dissolve today or tomorrow or after some time. So there is a moment and there is a period where grief has its place. I'm not saying that one should not feel grief, although there have been people in history who were so detached from the form that they genuinely do not feel grief. So it's okay to feel grief, but at the same time, the opportunity should be used to grow wiser. And I would recommend give that friend some books on reincarnation and on non-duality, and probably that will help them expand their own perspective. Question from Rhythms of Now. How can you tell if your Akashic record reading is true or a genuine reading? I think this question goes to all the different sorts of material that is coming through, whether it's channeling, whether it's reading, and so on. Any information that tries to sow fear in you is negative information. Any information that takes you toward love and joy is correct information. So, the genuine information will always take you to your higher and best self. And that's the way to identify it as true. Question from Spaceman. How can you enjoy all the natural things that you may desire without becoming excessive or hedonistic? Example, becoming a drug addict, alcoholic, and so on. So, alcohol and drugs are not natural substances, in my opinion. They are mass produced chemicals that are produced to keep us enslaved. So, natural means actually you should not be dabbling with anything that can mess up with your mind. Natural means instead of getting influenced through substances, try to spend time in nature and try to detach from everything and sit by yourself. That to me is really being in a natural setting. Now, due to the mass commercialization, alcohol and drugs and all these things have become very popular. And once again, it's almost too easy to see the commercial aspect through which these are promoted and they are associated in our minds. So I think the journey starts with detoxification with what we are not before we really find out what we are. Question from Amanda. What are your thoughts on holotropic breathing? I have heard about it. I don't have a personal experience in it, but as I said, you are on your own path. So feel free to experiment and see what works for you. Question from Uriya. I practice Tantra as well as psychedelic experiences in a very conscious way. Everything is sacred, isn't it? You are right. Everything is sacred, but at the same time, make sure that these don't become limitations and you don't become too dependent on these forms, which the goal is to transcend forms and go in a higher consciousness. Question from Jill. Why is the veil thinning? And the answer is just as we evolve physically as a species, we also evolve spiritually and in consciousness. So we are nearing a stage where what we could have learned in the past, there's a possibility we are going to a new degree of learning. And in one sentence, this is instead of learning from suffering, we are going to be learning from joy. And that's why the veil is thinning. Question, is Brahmin a type of religion? No. All I'm teaching here is post-religious. So, religions have served their purpose. Now it's time to go beyond religions into true spirituality, which is a unifying and universal philosophy rather than a religion. Question from National Dance. Does it mean that people channeled from the other side only communicate positive information? That's not correct. There are all sorts of channels. Again, remember that this is an infinite universe and there are infinite pathways. So be very careful about channeled information and make sure that you are listening to positive sources. Question from Jack. How does this work when dealing with the pain of infidelity from a long-term marriage? I think it's a very, I understand that this is a very emotionally sensitive and probably something that emotionally hurts, right? But again, the institution of marriage itself is only a few thousand years old. And even though, again, the backdrop of how we should relate to one another is highly determined through social conditioning. So with that in background, if you let go of the judgment and let the other person be who they want to be, that will bring you peace in the long term. Question from Stacy. How would you introduce your child to this kind of living or these concepts? It's a great question. At this point, there is not material that's specifically written for children that can help them. However, I recommend that you yourself, first of all, become familiar with this new way of thinking. And then you have a discussion with your children. There is a moment in time where they will come to you and say, what happens when we die? And that's the point to tell them about what your perspective is. And if they are genuinely looking, you can give them books such as Journey of Souls. Question from Donovan. How would an astral form become physical? Is it possible? I haven't looked too much into this. So I'm not sure I can really answer your question. So the books on yoga that I talked about, there are 3 books that I recommend. The first one is called Sadguru, More Than a Life. Sadguru is alive today, so that's why I recommend that one first. The second one is called Autobiography of a Yogi. And the third one is called Play of Consciousness. Question from Mimi. If we will be learning from joy, does that mean that we are entering a new dimension? Exactly. Jill, I think I answered your question. The question is, what's your opinion as to why the veil is thinning around the globe? As I said before, the time to graduate is approaching. We have spent the time in darkness as a collective, and now it's time to go to the light. Great question from Bodhiwada. How can we overcome suffering when we are surrounded by everywhere in this world every day? We can't live in a secluded cave. The great challenge and the great joy of this age is to live in the marketplace and experience the peace. And that's what it's all about. Now, this obviously requires a very high level of awareness. The risk that we have is there is so much going on around us that we can just forget who we are and get caught up in the drama. And that drama is on TV, that drama is in politics, that drama is all around us. So as a practice, the first step is to dedicate some time in your day. I would recommend morning, where you really get in touch with your true being and see the external connections as what they are. These are not you. Once your practice deepens, you will become, over a period of time, you will begin to live in this state despite whatever is going on in your life outside. And I will also recommend take on some practice of yoga that will help you. Question from Magdalena. How can you awaken feminine sexual energy and raise it upward so you can experience bliss in all body? There are books on sacred sexuality in different parts of the world. The book that I talked about before, it's called Living the Law of One, that goes into this experience more if you want to read. But once again, these are not quick tricks. These are not some things that you can learn in a workshop and then your life is completely changed. These are practices that sometimes take years or even decades. So make sure you have the right expectations, and then make sure that you are with the process without judging the process too harshly. Okay, we are almost out of time. I can take, maybe we can stay here for 10 more minutes if anybody has any questions. Question from Mimi. Does entering a new dimension mean that this world is ending soon? Don't think of it in terms of ending and beginnings. It's a graduation. So, what that means is that there'll be a shift in consciousness, and there is a path for two different kinds of consciousness. There are people who want to transcend, and there are people who don't want to transcend, and they will continue living in a similar reality on this planet or some other place. But there is a substantial mass of people who will graduate to the next level. Question from Steven. Are all yoga practices created equal, or is there one that I recommend? So the true yoga, understand that true yoga is not a teaching, it's a transmission. Think of it as a seed. If you have a garden, you can buy all the equipment, you can have the bundle, you can have a beautiful garden, but unless you have a seed, nothing can help you. So similarly, a true yogic initiation is that seed that a realized master can give you, and with practice, you cultivate that seed into a plant. The, the teachings that I recommend at this point, one is Sadhguru. He has an initiation called Shambhavi Mudra that you want to take, and then after that, you want to take a practice. There is another one from Siddha Yoga, and the initiation there is called Shaktipat, which literally means transmission of energy. So look at these two paths and see which one works for you. Question from MS. Can you give your view on Kundalini Yoga? Yes, as I said before, there are lots and lots of teachers, but there are really, really few true ascended masters who can transmit energy. So what you want is a teacher who can transmit energy and give you the seed rather than just somebody who can give you intellectual understanding. I'm typing the two books that I recommend. The first one is Sadhguru, More Than a Life. And the second is Play of Consciousness. Question from Donovan. Can people descend? I assume you are talking about people going more and more into darkness. And the answer is, actually, we all do. The reason we are where we are is that we started from a place much higher. And at one point, we thought that to learn through darkness is still a valid path. And that's why we are where we are today. So, people do descend. The point is not to judge them or invalidate their path. Okay, I will take just a couple of last questions and then we'll be done. Question from Robin. How can actually this is the last question, so we'll be done after this one. How can the earth be healed by this practice? Climate change, for example. How do people learn to solve problems created by people that impacts the environment? So we are evolving from consciousness as an individual to consciousness as a group. And just as an individual, we learn through darkness. As a group, we are learning through darkness and using our energies in destructive ways. That being said, once there is a sufficient number of us that awaken, the course will change. So, let's not worry too much about what is happening out there. I think what's of critical importance is what's happening within us. And as long as we can manage the inner aspect, whatever is happening outside has served its purpose. Question from Ivona. What are your thoughts about practicing Tai Chi versus yoga? So when I say yoga, this is not a physical form like Tai Chi. I'm talking about yoga, the word, which means a union between the individual soul, individual self, and the Supreme Self. So in proper yoga, what is known as yoga today is just one part, which is called asanas, which is body postures. These were meant to give you a healthier body, but they are not the end. These are just one step in an 8-step process. So true yoga is much beyond, because it has to do with energy and growing the energy as a seed and flowering that energy as a plant eventually. Question from Kit. How do we pray from this perspective? Again, you have to realize that you yourself are the supreme reality. So, when you pray, instead of having a God outside of you, you have to think about your own inner being as the higher being, and you are just trying to become that higher being through your actions. So the prayer changes completely from this perspective. Again, prayer is a practice just like any other practice. The goal of any practice is to go within and realize that you are the supreme being. You are Brahman. And as long as the practice helps you do that, the practice is valid. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And once again, I apologize for the technical problems we had when we started. I will make sure that I will test everything before the next time. See all of you in a month.